Okay, hi everybody. I'm Krista. For those that I think everybody here I've met, or had the pleasure of meeting, I should say. This is my pre-research talk, small project with big data. So I have no disclosures, I have no money. So overview of my talk. I'm going to spend a significant amount of the time talking about big data and explaining why I want to devote a significant amount of my research time to learning the tools of how to do big data and how to work big data. Go through the timeline, and then I'll just kind of briefly go over my smaller projects, which are actual projects that I can get real manuscripts and things published from. And I'll focus on one of them, which is going to be the cost and value of robotic surgery. So I feel like this is kind of a biased group, but how many of you have heard of big data or know what big data is? Okay. So big data is sort of the new thing. And what it is I think it's really sort of the future of personalized medicine, the future of the way that data is going to work. And it's already been in use. So what I have here is an example. So when you go to Amazon or Netflix, sites that we all use, you get these like recently featured items. And this is mine because I'm such a good head and neck resident. So they're using like based on my buying preferences and based on things that I've looked at in the past. Maybe I want some more ANC board prep, or maybe they know that I need that. And then, for instance, I do a lot of running and buy a lot of running gear on Amazon, and they know that I've bought a fuel belt in the past, so they're like, why don't you get this attachment for your fuel belt? So how do they know when you go to these sites that these are things that I might be interested in buying, or that these are things that they should target at me? And the way that they do it is with this big data analysis. So really what it is, it's predictive analysis. And it's really a new kind of growing field, and the epicenter of it all is here in Silicon Valley, kind of developed out of Google and the people in this area. So the first, big data contains 3 V's, so that's kind of how I want to explain big data. The first V is volume. So it's really looking at data sets in a different way. So previously, there are caps on the amount of data that you can reliably store, because they're very, very expensive. So they have SANs, which are storage area networks, that are kind of remote clouds or remote networks that you can access data from. But you can't possibly keep all of your data on that SAN because you're getting into petabytes of data at some point. And that's just way too expensive. So what people do is they edit their data and they throw away data. But how do you know that maybe that one data point that you threw away is not useful in the future? If you've lost it, then you'll never be able to analyze it. So the way that big data is getting around that now is we'll get into it a little bit, but they have these distributed file systems that actually store data on hardware. And they have open source software now that we can use to access that, store it, and reliably check it. The next key of big data is variety. So really what that means is that now, when we input data into any sort of spreadsheet or any sort of database, we have to edit it. We have to put it into binary code or maybe put it into a numerical form. We have lost the ability to store semi or unstructured data. One example of how that might come into play is if you have transcriptions of a customer service agent with the customer. You can transcribe the interaction and you can say, oh, yes, that was a positive or negative. And that could be your code that you put into a data set. But what you don't have is that actual transcription. Now with big data, you can store that, maybe that MP3 file. And maybe in the future, there will be analytics that can listen to the MP3 file and determine the tone of voice and how that could have potentially contributed to that customer's interaction. And the idea is that we want to store all the data in its raw format because we don't know yet what value that will have to us in the future. Another example of big data and how it's used currently to sort of collect all of the information in its raw format is Google Maps. So what it does is it takes your current GPS point, it takes where you want to go, it takes into account traffic situations, routes, you can select whether you want to use highways or street roads, and maybe in the future they'll be able to analyze your car and your fuel efficiency and how you drive based on the routes that you've taken and sort of the speed and your efficiency. And it'll be able to tailor sort of your best route to you. And in terms of medicine, I think we have so many different forms of data. We have vitals, we have notes, we have interactions with patients, we have videos, we have pictures. And we want to collect all of this information kind of in its raw format. And how else can we do it without big data? And finally, the last V is velocity. So really this is kind of the idea of real-time data analysis. So the ability to constantly store and update data so that as we're creating these large data set trends, we kind of can tailor the medicine to the patient as the patient situation changes. So collecting not only what has happened to the patient in the past, but what is currently happening to the patient, and what other technologies are out there we can input into these systems. One example of that is the online shopping or travel shopping. And the way that you see that in sort of on this big data network is it not only looks at where you've been and what you've done, but it looks at how long you've looked at things. So not just your purchasing history, but also where you're accessing these sites from. And maybe you looked at a certain pair of shoes for 2 hours. Then in your inbox, you magically get this coupon. They're like, oh, these shoes went on sale. They know that you've done that. They know that you've done that, and they do that in real time. So they're using this ability to sort of target you. So why can't we use that kind of technology to target medicine? And in terms of cancer research, eventually to put the genetics into there and sort of target treatment options for patients. So how do you do this, and is this really possible, and am I just making all this up? So the way that they have several different platforms now, but Apache Hadoop is a group created out of Google, and Hadoop is just a silly name based on one of the guys who created it. He had a son with a little yellow toy elephant that he named Hadoop, and he thought that was a cool name. But what it is the storage part of it are the Hadoop distributed file system. So it's an open source software that you can use to store on real computers or real hardware. And it takes data and it splits it up into little nodes or clusters, and it distributes it across different systems. So let's say you have, for simplification, you have 3 different computers, and you have a data set that's split up into A, B, and C. It will put file A onto computer 1 along with file B, and then computer 2 will have B and C, and then computer 3 will have C and A. And the reason why it does it is that you always have replication. There's like mother nodes that kind of check it and make sure that your data is always in sync. So that's how it gets around errors in the data. And also, then when you go to processing and analysis of the data, using this MapReduce, what it does is that instead of running an analysis conventionally, kind of in a linear fashion, it takes all those different nodes and it analyzes them in parallel. So it's like you have 3 people doing one job, and then it gets to the next level, and then it does it stepwise in parallel sequence. So how do we write the code for Hadoop analysis? Right now it's mostly in Python. There is some Java, and I have a little bit of Java background, and I've looked into Python coding, and it's not too far off. You don't need a strong Python coding background, but you do need a working framework in order to access these things. Other add-ons to it is Pig and Hive. So what it is you have the Hadoop distributed file system, sort of where your data is stored. MapReduce sits on top of that and allows you to access, analyze your data. Pig and Hive are kind of adjuncts to MapReduce. So if you're not super proficient at writing Python, Pig and Hive actually allows you to query data in more plain language. So they're kind of add-on simpler coding methods. And then there's Impala, which if you're familiar with SQL, you can actually bypass the MapReduce system and query the Hadoop distributed file system directly without going through MapReduce. So how does anybody get background in these things? Well, actually through Stanford Spectrum online kind of courses, they have free access to these Udacity and Udemy courses. They're actually all kind of created right here in Silicon Valley, and we have free access to these. There's about, I think in the basic framework to learn them, there's about 20 different courses, and they're a couple hours each to work through, and we have free access to that. So I'm planning to do that. I've already started my refresher course on Java, and I'm planning to finish a 1-hour segment in Python. So when I start in July, that's kind of my plan, is to start doing these online courses. That'll carry out, and actually in May, just 3 weeks ago, was the Big Data Conference here at Stanford, where they bring in speakers from all over the world that kind of are at the forefront of big data. And at this time, I don't think I have enough of a working knowledge of big data to ask the appropriate questions or to know the power of big data. But I'm hoping that after I get a better background, I will be able to go to the Big Data conference in May and actually network with people and be able to ask the appropriate questions so that we can sort of use big data for medicine and for our purposes, which I'm hoping will happen, because right now the big data analytics and the people in medicine, we're not really speaking the same language yet, so we don't really know what they need. They don't really know what our needs are, and we don't really know what the possibilities are or what questions we can even be asking. And then these are my other little projects. So I have the robotics cost project that I'll go over very briefly, the CT MRI and deafness, congenital deafness project, which is just sort of a database. And then with Dr. Sunwoo, we're trying to create a new head and neck database to parallel Epic, and they're actually, it's not quite big data, but it's they're trying to make a very powerful database with all sorts of information, and it's not completely unstructured data, but it's getting closer to that. So, kind of switching gears and just briefly touching on actual real research that will produce some sort of publishable data. I have this project with Dr. Holsinger on the cost and value of robotic head and neck surgery. So briefly, background, we know now that there's been studies that show that transoral robotic surgery compared to either open conventional surgery and or upfront chemoradiation therapy is comparative in sort of early morbidity outcomes and early functional outcomes. And there's ongoing trials to sort of evaluate the long-term progression-free survival and functional outcomes of these patients. But there's no current published data that evaluates the cost and value of TORs. There are two papers that sort of tried to do this. One by De Almeida that actually looked at TORs versus chemoradiation using a regression model with Markov regression model where they have hypothetical patients, but it's not based on actual real data or real patients. And then the other paper by Bird et al. Looked at the cost effectiveness of TORs in cancers of unknown primaries. Unfortunately, there was an issue that was brought up in one of the comments on the paper that said that their cost formulas were off, and they had to go back and issue a statement kind of retracting the cost formula, admitting to that error, and then they said, but we stand by our conclusion, but their conclusion was that it's an effective means to locate the occult primary, and it no longer said anything about the cost efficiency of transoral robotic surgery. So our goals would be to compare the charges and costs for patients treated with open conventional surgery versus TORs, or those treated with upfront chemoradiation versus TORs. Well, there's probably about 15 patients total that have undergone the transoral robotic surgery that we're going to look at. We're going to try to stratify them based on the staging of their tumors, as well as gender match controls or gender age match controls. And then Dr. Samuel is actually really interested in sort of the cost analysis and cost efficiency of the hospital. So he's going to help us out with like the CPT coding and getting the actual cost charges. And then ideally, we want to take a full 365 days out from time of treatment. But I think realistically, taking a cursory glance at some of the data, it's probably going to be more likely than 6 months. So then we'll do a comparison based on stage, and again, we're going to try to age, gender match, and then hopefully develop a clinical pathway to direct patients towards highest value care. So then, taking this into account, one final word on big data. I think that really the future of what a lot of large institutions like Stanford are trying to do is designing tailor-made medicine, or designing medicine that fits the patient. And in terms of big data, there's so many factors that go into cancer treatment, not only the patient's stage of cancer and the medical treatment options that they have available, their past medical history and other things like that, but also their situation in life, whether they're going to get their cancer treatment here versus at home. And these are all things that can be fit into a big data analysis eventually. And I'm hoping that sort of the head and neck cancer database that I'm going to be helping Dr. Sunwoo out with is sort of a stepping stone to creating at least a repository for possible big data analysis in the future. So I just want to say thank you to Dr. Chang, who's my research mentor, and sort of my mentor for the radiology and congenital deafness project, Dr. Holsinger for the TORS project, Dr. Sunwoo for the head and neck cancer database, and then I'm also going to be doing a smaller prospective trial with Carlos Torre fell on incidence of sleep apnea in athletes, which will start in September.
My research next year will be focused on the role of perioperative systemic steroids in patients with CRS without polyps. This is a study I'll be doing in conjunction with Dr. Humphreys, our analogy fellow, and Dr. Wong. So first off, I'll start with a simple question that I think nicely outlines the rest of the talk today. This was a survey that was sent to 265 otolaryngologists in 2011 via email. Very simple question: do you prescribe oral steroids in the immediate postoperative period? Interestingly, the answers are a little bit all over the place. So 20% say, yes, I pretty much always prescribe steroids. 50% say only with patients with polyps or AFS. And then 28% say rarely or none of the time. So I think this is really reflective of the fact that there's just not a lot of convincing data regarding systemic steroid use to guide decision making, especially as it pertains to the perioperative period. So to go into a little bit of the background, oral steroids in patients with nasal polyposis is probably the best explored aspect of this issue. And there was a very thorough review done of all the available literature addressing the therapies that are used in CRS patients with and without polyps in 2013. There were 16 studies, 5 of which were randomized controlled trials, constituting level 2 evidence, and actually all of those showed statistically significant improvement in subjective and objective outcomes with both quantitative and qualitative measures. So based on this, the quality of evidence gets a rating of A, and the recommendation in this case is a strong recommendation. So now we look at oral steroids in patients without nasal polyposis, which is much less thoroughly evaluated. There were actually only 4 studies that were identified, all of which are case series and none of which are randomized clinical trials. 2 of these studies did demonstrate a statistically significant benefit in symptom and exam scores. One study showed a trend towards improvement but no statistical significance, and the last looked at combination medical therapy, so the actual effect of the steroids themselves was not able to be differentiated from the other therapies given. So currently, the recommendation level for this context is optional. Next, we move on to perioperative steroids. Sorry, actually, let's go over the expert committee guidelines first. So these are expert committee guidelines for patients with CRS without nasal polyposis. And in summary, the guidelines are relatively weak and highly variable. The reports that have been published, as we just saw, are limited to level 3 and level 4 evidence. And investigate oral corticosteroids as part of a multi-modality treatment regimen. There is an inference of improvement, but the conclusions that can be drawn from these are relatively limited. And so, in general, the literature currently fails to support the routine use of systemic steroids in the management of CRS without polyps. And the consensus grade for all of these expert committees is D, which is not great. So if we move on to perioperative steroids in patients with nasal polyposis, this is less well established, but it is explored. There are 4 studies, and the majority of the studies, 3 of them, actually only look at sort of operative parameters in patients that have received steroids. So they look at blood loss, operative time, the surgeon perceived level of difficulty. Only one of these studies actually looks at steroids as it pertains to patient improvement post-operatively, and that was this one. It was a study that was done in 2007 with 24 patients. They received 5 days of preoperative steroids and 9 days of postoperative steroids. And the other group received a placebo for the same amount of time. Interestingly, there was no significant difference in the symptom scores from the steroid and placebo group. However, there was a statistically significant difference in their Lund-Kennedy endoscopic scores, and also in this endoscopic scoring system that they developed in this paper called the POSE, which is short for perioperative sinus endoscopy. And They measured time points up from 1 week postoperatively all the way through 6 months, and said that at each time point, the steroid group and endoscopic appearance looked significantly better. And then we go into perioperative steroids in CRS without polyps. And I know this slide is blank. It is intentionally blank because there are no case reports, guidelines, randomized controlled trials, nothing addressing oral steroid use in this patient population, which is where our study comes in. So next year, I will spend the majority of my time focusing on the execution of a randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trial that investigates the role of perioperative steroids in patients without polyps. As we've just seen, there's no level 1 evidence. There's no evidence at all supporting their use. So we hope to make the first such contribution to this data set. And this is important not only in terms of establishing treatment guidelines, but also because steroids do carry a certain level of risk, and we should only be imparting that risk upon patients when it's clinically necessary. Another discussable point is that prescribing steroids does limit you in terms of some of the other therapies that you can give. So, for instance, patients that have culture-directed indications for fluoroquinolones, you are very cautious in simultaneously prescribing steroids and fluoroquinolones. To that end, we'll look at the efficacy of oral steroids in the perioperative setting, and also monitor any adverse effects that the patient's experience. So in terms of patient selection, again, we are only looking at patients with CRS without polyposis, so we'll be excluding those with polyps. They have to have CRS as defined by the guidelines that were just released a couple months ago. Patients with AERD, cystic fibrosis, any immunosuppressive states, or those that have received steroids within the 30 days prior to surgery will not be included. And then study design, we'll just be randomizing into 2 groups. So one group will receive oral prednisone and a steroid nasal spray, and the other group will receive an oral placebo and a steroid nasal spray. And then everyone will receive augmentin for 2 weeks and do twice daily nasal saline medications. This slide is a little bit confusing. We wanted to power our study to detect a clinical difference of 10% with a confidence interval of 95%. This is a non-inferiority study, which means that we are looking at the scenario in which omitting steroids is, quote-unquote, not inferior to giving them. So your null hypothesis in this case is that the difference between giving steroids and not giving steroids is greater than this 10% clinically detectable difference. And the alternative hypothesis is that the difference between them is not detectable or 0. So to keep the math basic, let's just say that all of those numbers and considerations go into this magic box, and then you get an N of 38. So we'll have 38 patients in each treatment group. We'll have 2 outcome measures, one subjective, one objective. Subjective measure is the SNOT-22 score, with which I'm sure we are all familiar and have seen many times. And then the objective score will be the Lund-Kennedy exam score, which is an endoscopic evaluation of discharge, edema, crusting, and applicable in this case polyps. Patients will be seen at 1, 3, and 6 weeks postoperatively, and then again at 3 and 6 months postoperatively. We'll be doing the SNOT-22 and the Lund-Kennedy score at each visit. And then we will also ask them to document any perceived side effects that they might be experiencing from the steroid therapy. For our data analysis, we'll look at the differences in the pre-op and post-op symptom and endoscopic scores. Those will be calculated and compared between the steroid and the placebo groups. That'll be done with a paired t-test. So again, we're powered to detect a 10% difference in outcome measures and 95% confidence interval. So this figure is to show that this is a one-tailed distribution. A non-inferiority study means you're using a one-tailed distribution, which is actually different than an equivalency study, which uses a two-tailed distribution. And the reason that we're using this non-inferiority study is because that is what is most commonly used when you're looking at a new study drug and you're in a phase 3 clinical trial. That is the kind of data analysis that is done. So we thought that would be most appropriate in this case. And we're using this construct to determine if our placebo group outcomes are equivalent or inferior to our steroid group outcomes. So those are the bottom two questions that we'll be answering. Potential pitfalls of the study. Anytime you have a study involving patients having to do things unsupervised at home by themselves, there will be a certain amount of non-compliance. So we're hoping that, first of all, by limiting the study to 2 weeks of therapy, we are going to eliminate some of that study fatigue that comes with a long duration. And then we will also have to have patients keep sort of a diary to come in with and make sure that they've actually been administering medications as directed. The other problem is that, especially at this institution, we get a lot of patients that have had disease for a long time. They've had a ton of steroids. And a lot of people are very familiar with how they feel when they're on steroids. So that will be an issue in the case that people that did not receive steroids will know, I'm not taking a steroid. And so that eliminates part of the blindness of the study. And then finally, as I'm sure you've noticed, we don't have, in the traditional sense of the word, a no treatment. And that is because current evidence suggests that intranasal corticosteroids are strongly recommended in the postoperative period. So we felt like it would be relatively unethical and also not appealing to the IRB to completely withhold steroids in these patients. In the future, after this particular work is completed, we have a couple directions we'd like to go. Since Dr. Humphreys will be at the University of Washington next year, this study at his institution as well. So we are IRB approved for a multi-site study. And then right now we're just looking at patients without polyposis, mostly because the data is weaker there. But we would eventually like to look at patients with polyposis as well, since as you saw there is still relatively limited and weak evidence for the perioperative use of steroids in that population. One other thing that we've discussed is comparing the efficacy of oral and topical steroids, and actually in the initial iteration of this study we had wanted to include a third treatment group looking at budesonide irrigations, but for financial and logistical reasons that became impractical relatively quickly, but is also an important study to do. And then finally, one sort of outlining issue that has become apparent in reading all of this data, looking at all of these studies, is that no one uses the same steroid regimen across any institution, and even among surgeons in similar institutions. So, for the way future down the road, we could potentially look at establishing an ideal steroid regimen that could be standardized for postoperative care. I would like to thank Dr. Humphreys and Dr. Long. They've given me a ton of help in getting this approved by the IRB, and also applying for a grant, which we unfortunately did not get. But it was very helpful in sort of getting all the research together and also preparing this talk. So I will take any questions.
When they turn you back.